This week we're going to talk about cultural evolution, putting a bit more structure and focusing on specific mechanisms within this very broad concept. The overall goals that we want to look at are, first of all, to understand a little bit more about the dynamics of cultural evolution and transmission types. Then we look into paradoxes of social learning. We will discuss transmission biases and the issue of fidelity. We will return to the concept of cumulative culture and discuss some of these very interesting questions around cumulative culture in humans, but also in animals a bit more. And we will also briefly touch on language as a cultural trait. So this is our framework for this week's modules. And the big challenge for us is to understand how was it possible that humans, as the only species, have been able to get all the way to the moon. If you think about it, it requires such a complex net of interactions between individuals that are not genetically related at all. As we discussed repeatedly, genetic relatedness can explain a lot of dynamics around cooperation, but it cannot explain how people that have nothing to do with each other are able to cooperate over extended time periods and extended geographical distances to create technology that would allow us to send somebody safely to the moon, survive for a limited period of time on a very hostile in a very hostile environment that we were not evolutionarily adapted to survive in, and then return back to planet Earth. This is an achievement that is absolutely incredible, and we're going to look at some of these dynamics that allowed us, as the only species, to achieve. Cultural evolution is also somewhat a missed opportunity. Darwin, in his writing, was very explicit that cultural mechanisms, he didn't mention it in this way, but things that or processes that we now associate with cultural evolution were things that he already talked about. He was not aware of the concept of genes, yet biologists in particular have focused on the biological side of evolution, to the detriment of the cultural transmission of information. So it is in a way a missed opportunity, if we look back now, that the biological understanding or our understanding of biological evolution is much more advanced than our understanding of cultural evolution. And this is also something we have to keep in mind when judging what we know about cultural evolution today, because as a field it's probably not older than about 40 years, whereas there's an extensive body of research looking at biological evolution already. But the interest in cultural evolution has grown steadily over the last couple of years, culminating a few years ago in the founding of a society that is specifically dedicated to the study of cultural evolution, aptly named the Cultural Evolution Society. And you can join it. It's a very transdisciplinary network of researchers interested in understanding how we can study evolutionary processes through a cultural lens. So I'm pretty confident in the years to come, our understanding, our appreciation of the intricacies and the power of cultural evolution is going to skyrocket. So, without further ado, let's start with the overview of our first part, where we talk about some central mechanisms in cultural evolution, specifically different transmission forms, and we will also talk about a social learning paradox and how to actually solve that. And then we will go and talk a little bit more about cultural transmission biases and the problem of fidelity. Cultural evolution follows Darwinian principles. So this is work that was very much championed by Alex Masudi during his PhD, for example, which culminated in a book entitled Cultural Evolution, in which he very meticulously and carefully laid out the similarities between biological and cultural evolution. Cultural evolution follows the same principles as natural selection. So we have variation. So if we think about, for example, cultural artifacts like bow and arrow, there are variations between different bows, and some of these bows are just fitter, are better than others. So we have also the principle of differential fitness. And the knowledge to make these bows is inherited, it's transmitted socially, culturally, through learning. So individuals learn how to make bows from others. And these adaptations that bows went through also accumulate over time. So we have more sophisticated bows today than we had probably 10,000 years ago. So cultural evolution follows the same principles as natural selection. But there are also important differences. First of all, with natural selection, we have a very clear unit of information, the replicator, which is the gene. For cultural transmission, people had talked about the meme, following Richard Dawkins, and we had talked about the introduction of the meme concept to the sciences by Richard Dawkins, and I mentioned briefly Susan Blackmore's work on meme as the kind of cultural replicator. The interesting thing is that memes as a concept has not really taken off as a scientific idea. It has been very important in the social sphere. We are all familiar with memes as social concepts, but it has not really taken off because it reflects one of the general challenges for cultural evolution, that is, we don't have a clear idea of how cultural information packages are being passed on. So we don't have the clear equivalent to a gene for natural selection. So the information vector very clearly in natural selection is genetics, information encoded in the DNA, but for cultural transmission it is behavior and information that is captured in or like stored in the central nervous system. So it's much more variable because it veers along multiple vectors, behaviors. We will talk about language, we will talk about symbols in a minute. The transmission mechanism for genetic transmission is obviously DNA duplication, whereas for cultural transmission, we will talk about it in a few minutes, draws heavily on imitation, and of course also other processes like social facilitation, imprinting, and obviously learning and teaching. Mutations in the genetic transmission genetic transmission are linked to duplication errors. In cultural transmission processes, it is learning errors and it's also recombination. It is linked to innovation, so where people actually through trial and error come up with new ideas. And so one of the key differences in this sense is the type of process. Genetic transmission is very clearly following natural selection mechanisms. So this is the kind of Darwinian Wallace type of transmission, whereas cultural transmission is much more alike Lamarckian transmission. And one of the key differences here as well is, therefore, transmission of acquired characteristics is absolutely central for cultural transmission, but is something that people have ruled out quite strongly for genetic transmission, with some caveats around some of the issues of, for example, epigenetic mechanisms. Right? So cultural evolution follows Darwinian principles of natural selection, but it also differs in important ways. Specifically, our lack of understanding of how information units are actually packaged and passed on. But again, to emphasize this, Darwin and the biologists that followed him were not aware of the gene, but nevertheless were able to understand and study processes till the genetic information was um, better understood. So, high fidelity transmission of genetic information, as we know, has been linked to the transmission of biological information has been linked to genes through the modern synthesis, which integrated natural selection and genetic understanding of biology. So now let's look at these transmission pathways of cultural information. We have to first think about that individuals can learn through trial and error. So this is often called individual learning, where you work out what works in a specific environment, and it is often seen as quite costly because it takes time for the individual. It is error prone, so you might waste a lot of time. It can be dangerous because, for example, if you think about food, if you eat the wrong plant or the wrong food, you might actually get sick or you might die. On the other hand, social learning is linked to a number of different sources. So we have obviously our parents. We can learn from closely related kin, so people in our family. We can pick up information from other individuals in our society, so non-kin. We have societal norms, and we have also, of course, peers we can learn from. And so this is all packaged under the, like umbrella term social learning. And this allows us now to think about a number of different transmission pathways. The first one is vertical, from parent to child. So similar to genetic transmission, it is vertical transmission from parent to offspring. It can be positive and can be negative. We can learn both adaptive behaviors and maladaptive behaviors, of course. The second one is horizontal transmission. So here, individuals learn from each other within the same generation. So this is a very common form of cultural transmission among humans, where you learn from your peers. This is also what we try and stimulate in your foraging groups, where you use opportunities to interact with each other and learn with each other. And then, of course, we have oblique transmission, where people of a different generation who are not your parents pass on information, hence oblique. And we can now differentiate a few more subtypes within the oblique type and go through some of the key differences between them. So vertical, obviously, the transmitting partner is the parent and the receiver is the offspring. The acceptance of innovation is typically relatively moderate. Parents may engage in some innovation, and children may accept it. But there's also a lot of variation between individuals and between family units. So this limits the rate of cultural evolution that can occur, because the information is contained in very small units and there's relatively little innovation going on. Then, of course, we have horizontal transmission, where the transmitter and the receiver are mutually unrelated genetically. Typically, the acceptance of innovation is relatively easy and fast. You can just think about, for example, the youth cultures that very quickly come up with new ways of thinking about ideas, solving problems, etc., etc. There's often relatively high variation between individuals. And because, as we have seen, the rate of evolution is tied to variation, because of the large variation that is available and the large number of individuals and the fast spread of innovation, rates of cultural evolution can be relatively rapid if we look at horizontal transmission forms. So horizontal transmission forms are very important for understanding cultural evolution and learning. And then of course we have oblique. We can distinguish two major types here. Oblique transmission, where it's one to many, so one transmitter, typically a teacher or a leader, transmitting information to many receivers, many pupils or disciples. So the classic example here is the school or education system. The acceptance of innovation is relatively fast, typically, because it is a structured way of disseminating innovation. If you think about an education system, variation between individuals is typically relatively low because you have very little choice, but you have to pay attention and learn. Of course, there's some variation, but it is relatively limited. But on the other hand, because you have a captive group and you have a very centralized way of transmitting new information, it can facilitate a rapid rate of cultural evolution. And then of course we also have oblique many-to-one transmission. So this is often tied to societal norms or to ideologies, mass media, etc., where you have the transmitter, which could be elders, peer groups, or individuals that are in charge of propaganda, and the receiver typically is youth. The acceptance of innovation, because we know norms are typically relatively, societal norms in particular, are often relatively conservative, so there's relatively low acceptance of innovation. There's relatively low variation between individuals because it is communicated at a broad level. And with all of these things considered together, the rate of cultural evolution through this oblique many-to-one transmission is often relatively low. So the important point here really is we have three major types of transmission: vertical, horizontal, oblique. Oblique can be further distinguished into one-to-many or many-to-one, and these transmission forms differ in the facility to which they can induce cultural evolution. So with relatively high speeds of cultural evolution being possible through horizontal transmission, and specifically also through standardized teaching systems, so oblique one-to-many, but vertical, so transmission in families and normative societal norm processes typically reduce rates of cultural evolution somewhat. So, in the next session, we're going to look at what makes learning actually so challenging or difficult to understand.